My goodness, is it that time again already? Well, welcome back to Acton Tarn's Great Library, home of tales that recall a world that was and shape a world yet to come. Whatever that means. Today we have for you another story from Acton Tarn's long and peculiar history, this time one of several tales of our beloved bone chief Opu Haku. Of course, as we all know, there are many stories about Obuhaku, several of which contradict each other, and yet they are all completely true. The world is strange like that. Now, the author of today's tale is the spectacular Sarah Remy, also writing as Alex Hall. Sarah is far too busy saving the world, I imagine, to attend our humble library, but they have graciously given us permission to read their tale, The Errand, on their behalf. And quite a tale it is too, I think you'll agree. So without further ado, The Errand. For the third time in as many days, Crow wished he wasn't a vegetarian. The delicious scents wafting around North Rib's ribs made his stomach grumble and his mouth water. It felt a little like a betrayal to want so badly what he couldn't have. Still, his gaze followed each plate of ribs and sauce as old Crawman shuffled orders from the kitchen in the back to the hungry customers waiting in the dining room out front. Crow's supper, when it came, was much less appetizing. Cold algae soup with a hunk of crusty bread. At least the bread was still warm, and there was an extra pat of butter. Crawman, for all his gruff exterior, had a heart of gold. "Eat up," North Ribs' proprietor said as he thumped the food down onto the table. His wrinkled face creased in a smile. "You're on in 10. Looks like it's going to be a busy night. Good night for tips, if you're lucky." Crow grunted acknowledgements. The tips he'd pull in his travelling troubadour disguise were a nice bonus, but the tip he really wanted was from the contact he'd been expecting to meet at North Ribs 3 days earlier. Feeling sorry for himself, he broke off a bit of bread and dipped it in his soup while surreptitiously scanning the room for strangers. 36 hours hanging about in Acton Tarn's most popular food joints, and by now Crow knew most of the regulars by face, if not by name. The majority were anchors, enjoying an evening pint before heading home for the night. They had the weathered look of people who spent too much time out in Acton Tarn's unforgiving elements. Crow didn't envy them their calling, or the limbs and digits many of them had lost in battle or to their giant charges. The anchors kept mostly to themselves, huddled around the largest table, talking, as far as Crow could tell, mostly of the changing weather, and in whispers of the strange things happening around the village's god tree. The remaining smaller tables were taken up by locals in 1s or 2s or 3s. A young person scribbling in a book while they sipped at their pints, a loud family chowing down on a dangerously tilting pile of sauce-slathered ribs, a couple holding hands across the table and grinning like two love-struck moon calves. All locals. As far as Crow could tell, and Crow was very good at paying attention, he was the only out-of-towner inside the place. And that was a problem, because he really couldn't afford to linger waiting for a contact that never showed. He had bills to pay, expensive habits of the sort that a troubadour's tips just couldn't cover. Besides which, he'd come all the way to Acton Tarn on a specific errand. He was an assassin, not a bard. He took pride in his work. He enjoyed killing, and he especially enjoyed killing well. He was a professional for Ichor's sake, and always upheld his end of the bargain. He expected others to do the same, and grew irritable on the rare occasions they did not. Old Crawman circled back around from the kitchen, slapped Crow affably on the shoulder. "You're up, bard. Another pint to wet your whistle?" "No, thank you." The beer was sweeter than Crow liked. Pushing away from the table, he grabbed his gittern and made for the single stool placed at the front of the room. The gittern was special, carved from a single piece of wood and strung with terath hair. It had belonged to Crow's great-grandmother and was his second most treasured possession. The crowd quieted when he took his place, cradling the gittern on his lap as he tuned the strings. Travel over the desert was difficult, and Crow understood he was the first wandering musician to visit Acton Tarn in quite a while. He didn't have the strongest singing voice, but he had nimble fingers and a skill with the gittern that came from decades of practice. He was talented enough that maybe word had spread. North Ribs was busier than Crow had yet seen. He finished tuning and looked up to introduce himself and his first number. As he did so, the restaurant door burst open, and his contact fell inside. "You don't look like an assassin," Crow's contact grumbled. Crow's first set was over, and they were back at his table in the corner. Crow didn't take offence. He was small, soft around the edges, and wore spectacles for close reading, He knew he looked like a man who loved his couch more than murder. It was part of his charm. Crow's contact, on the other hand, looked like she could break a man's neck without any efforts at all. She was at least twice his height, her bare forearms corded with muscle. She wore the loose robes preferred by seasoned desert travellers, but Crow had no doubt the softly draped fabric hid a soldier's body. "You're late," he pointed out. 3 days late, in fact. "Trouble with elves in the east." She met his stare. Her eyes were black, lashes iridescent. Orc blood, Crow thought, and wondered what business an orcish soldier had running errands for the guild. But it wasn't his business to ask questions. Nosy assassins soon found themselves out of a job, if not dead and dumped down the handiest tar hole. "They say you should be careful with what you eat in Achtentan," said the orc. "That it's like with the fairies. A bite of the wrong thing and maybe you never want to leave, maybe you stay here forever. I'm not worried. Nothing will keep me more than a day in this scorched shithole." She waved a hand as Crawman hurried past. "Hey, old man, I'll have a bucket of the Boggerl's 5 alarm with extra sauce." Crow found the orc's hubris impressive, and her dedication to small talk alarming. "Have you got my mark or not?" "Sure." She showed him a mouthful of teeth before reaching under her robes and passing over a small square of actual paper. Crow's expression made her snort. Real paper was costly this side of the desert. The orc said, "Whoever ordered this hit must have plenty of coin to spare." She, like Crow, would have no idea of the mark's origins. They were cogs in a much larger machine. The piece of paper would have passed through several different hands before landing in front of Crow on a greasy table in North Ribs. "Came west over the mountains before reaching the desert is all I know." "Very hush-hush, as usual," she added. The blob of innocuous wax sealing the folded paper was still intact, the guildmaster's stamp clearly visible. Crow slit the note open with the small knife he kept on his belt. He unfolded the precious paper carefully, enjoying the feel of it on his fingertips. He wondered if it would smell like the old books he kept in his very expensive library, a library built up over decades of taking profitable guild contracts, or if the trip across the desert had somehow tainted that perfume. He would not reveal himself by sniffing it in front of the orc, however, so instead he read the 2 brief lines inked in the guildmaster's familiar, messy hand. Opu Haku. Before Mabon. "Mabon?" Crow exclaimed. "That's just 2 days from now. Your trouble with the elves has cost me valuable time." The orc shrugged. "That's your problem, friend. I did my part. I delivered the mark into your highly qualified hands, and now I'm going to have a lovely big supper and sleep in a comfortable, sand-free bed for the first time in 11 days. She lifted her pint glass, toasted Crow. "Cheers and good luck. And if anyone asks what business we did here, it's none of theirs." Opu Haku was easy to track down. As the village chieftain and a respected elder, the man's name was on every wagging tongue. Unfortunately, Opu Haku was also very visible, very much in demand, and, as far as Crow could tell, never allowed a moment of solitude. Not even when he needs to take a piss, Crow thought with sympathy, as he watched a group of loudly arguing Anchors accost Opu Haku midstream. The Anchors seemed to think nothing of interrupting their chieftain at his business. Opu Haku's resigned expression as he fastened his trousers was one of a man who had come to accept the weight of his responsibilities. Crow couldn't hear what the Anchors were arguing about, or whatever it was Opu Haku said to calm them down. Crow was concealed in the small crowd of villagers who gathered daily near Achtentan's disturbing god tree. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, Crow was told when he inquired. A show of respect, both to the tree and to the Anchors who had lost their lives trying to protect it. Crow suspected that as the days grew shorter, colder, and dustier, the people of Achtentan were just looking for a bit of entertainment, something to take their mind off the threat of winter. "He won't dare try to rebuild the fence," a young woman standing on her tiptoes to better see past those around her declared. "Will he? Not if it brings more of those creatures up from the ground. We lost half the Mirror Militia overnight, and besides which, we haven't got enough lumber for repairs." If by lumber the young woman meant the man-sized bone pickets lying broken at the foot of the god tree, Crow couldn't help but agree. And why would anyone build a fence out of bone anyway? Were the people of Achtentan too poor to trade for something sturdier? Or was there something in the culture that insisted on osseous architecture? The god tree, with its gigantic canopy and massive charred trunk, was alarming enough in itself. The horse-sized ants, red and black carapaces glittering in the twilight, mandibles working as they scuttled to and fro beneath and around the tree, made Crow sweat. He didn't much like insects, not even the small and harmless variety. Ants big enough to ride into war he could definitely do without. He'd been to a lot of unsettling places in the service of the guild. Arctantan was quickly climbing to the top of Crow's never again for love nor money list.
"They found another body in the burrows!"
cried someone at the front of the crowd. A gasp went up. Crow wormed his way forward until he stood up against the barrier, also bone, that Chief Opu Haku had erected to keep curious villagers back. An antcher lingered on the other side of the barrier, leaning against his ant, pretending relaxation as he scanned the crowd with sharp eyes. Whatever had attacked the fence around the god tree had come up from below, leaving behind gaping holes in the dusty soil before shattering bone and retreating into the depths again, dragging with it the corpses of the unfortunate anchors who had been guarding the tree. A few of the bravest soldiers had volunteered to ride search and rescue into the gaping holes. As far as Crow knew, they hadn't found any survivors, but there had been no lack of corpse parts. Obuhaku hurried around the god tree to one of the larger burrows, squatted to look down into the earth. Whatever he saw there made him shake his head and grip his beard in grief. Crow sighed. It was going to be a long evening, but surely the old man had to sleep sometime. "Ah," said Obuhaku when he entered his hut and found Crow sitting on his cot. It was long after moonrise, and the cold silver sky made the night as bright as day. "Who sent you? Sinaga? Dasvalti?" Crow rose. In his hand he held his first most treasured possession, an elegant brass-handled ice pick with a long steel tooth. It, like the gittern, had also belonged to his great-grandmother. She had used it to crack ice for her nightly cocktails. Crow preferred a bloodier addiction. Obuhaku backed towards the door, but the chieftain was a tired old man and Crow was a practiced killer. Quick as a June snake he darted, blocking the exit and crooking an arm around Obuhaku's throat. Obuhaku struggled, wheezing as Crow choked off his air. Crow's slight stature and soft edges fooled most people into believing he was harmless. He wasn't. He worked hard to stay fast and strong. "It doesn't matter," Obuhaku gasped when Crow stabbed him neatly in the armpit. Warm blood bathed Crow's fingers and ran down his wrist. "The god tree will overcome. Sachnumvat Kilsak!" What was this? Magic? Releasing Obuhaku, Crow backed away. The contact had said nothing about magic. Magic cost extra, and for good reason. Crow never approached a mage without proper protection, and proper protection came dear. Obuhaku collapsed on his cot where he lay dying, his blood staining the bedding and the dirt floor. Crow was more concerned with the sudden smell of ozone in the hut and the shaking of the ground beneath his feet. He turned to run, but not fast enough. He was caught about the ankle, anchored in place by a thick, prehensile tentacle bursting up from beneath the hut's foundation. No, not a tentacle, a root. The god tree? Could it reach so far? By Icar it seemed it could, and if the bone-snapping strength of the root was any indication, the god tree was angry. "Fuck me!" groaned Crow as he hacked at the root with his ice pick. If he survived Arctantan, he needed to have strong words with the guildmaster. Agony made his stomach curdle. For a moment he feared he would pass out. Instead, he stabbed again and again, driving the steel tooth through bark and fleshy pulp. Sticky black sap mingled with Obuhaku's blood on the ground. The root flexed, making Crow scream, but then his blade must have landed a real hit because it flinched, quivering as it loosened, retreating beneath the foundation. Crow was suddenly, astoundingly free. His ankle would never be the same. Weeping at the pain of it, he scrambled on hands and knees out of Obuhaku's hut and into the moonlight. The night was quiet, the village sleeping, and where were Obuhaku's eternal guards? Something's off. Leaning against the hut, he pulled himself upright. He could barely walk, let alone make a break across the desert on one leg. I'm screwed. The thought of a botched errand made Crow furious. The thought of being strung up for murder made him shiver. Hey you, Bard. Looks like that problem of yours fought back. Need a hand? It was the orc soldier, grinning at him from shadows. Crow's gittern was tucked under one arm, the reins of a giant black ant harnessed and saddled looped around her wrist. Obuhaku's 2 guards lay crumpled in the dust at her feet. You knew, Crow accused. He took an angry hop forward, swayed. The orc caught him before he could pull. The chieftain was a powerful necromancer. Yes, the elves in the east had a thing or two to say about old Opu Haku and his nastier tricks. But you've got a rep, you're supposed to be the best. I figured you could handle it. I did! Pain and frustration made Crow snarl. The bastard's dead, isn't he? Congratulations, replied the orc mildly. Would you like a ride out of town before the villagers realise you've murdered their bone wizard? Or do you prefer death by angry mob? As if as an afterthought, she added, I should say my help doesn't come cheap. Help me. Crow thought he heard voices in the distance, Achtentan stirring. Name your price. I'm good for it. Oh, I know you are. The orc smiled as she helped him onto the ant. Her sharp teeth shone in the moonlight. Why do you think I stuck around? Thank you ever so much to Sarah Remy for allowing us to read their story, The Errand, and thank you to you, our friendly audience, for taking time out from ant wrangling or godfruit paste huffing or whatever it was you were doing. Sarah Remy, who also writes as Alex Hall, is a non-binary, animal-loving, proud gamer geek. Their work can be found in a variety of cool places, including HarperVoyager, Edge, and NineStar Press, and you can follow them on Twitter at Sarah Remy Writes. That's SarahRemywrites. I can personally recommend their book Ernest Inc., written as Alex Hall, because it really is a very good book. Ernest Inc. It's good. Thank you again for coming, and we here at the Great Library hope you enjoyed your stay. Sounds from the Year Between is a production of Skullgate Media, the new independent writers collective / indie publisher with big dreams of many wonderful things. This podcast is produced by Dee Gagliardi and Chris Durston with help from Chris Van Dyke. This episode was hosted and edited by Chris Durston, and all music was improvised by Chris Durston. Sounds from the Year Between is the podcast companion to Tales from the Year Between, our biannual anthology series where each volume is set in a new, collectively created world. Go to skullgatemedia.com or yearbetween.com to learn more and to buy our books because they're very good. Or follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram as Skullgate Media. Today's story was The Errand by Sarah Remy, and that story appears in Achtentan, Land of Dust and Bone, Volume 1 of Tales from the Year Between. Take care, stay safe, and we'll see you again very soon.